Hi, my name is Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos I'm doing on tutorials in game design, and it's part of a wider suite of videos about game design. And in this one, I'm going to present some design thoughts, some considerations you might want to bear in mind when you're designing tutorials for games. Okay, so the first section of this is I'm going to talk about some barriers that tutorials present, and these are things that I did in mentioned in an earlier video in the series, and now we're going to look at some thoughts about how to deal with these particular barriers. So the first one is the barrier to getting started. The feeling that the tutorial is kind of in the way and you wanted to get playing the game. So some of the pictures that I've got in this video are particularly from sports games, so getting started. So there are some ways to deal with this. Obviously, early interaction in terms of the player getting to do something early on is good. I guess we've all played games where you feel like the first 15 minutes is all about the cutscenes and the backstory and things like that. And for some games this is reasonable, but for other games it's possibly better to actually get the player playing and then introduce that stuff as you go along or a bit later. Because the whole point of what the player wants to do is to play the game. So try and get them interacting early with the game. Another thing is the kind of tutorials that I hate are the press this, press that tutorials, the ones where it gives you a very direct instruction. You need to do this, and then you need to do that. And it's not the best way to teach. And one of the reasons it's not the best way to teach is because it doesn't engage the mind. All you're doing is engaging the person clicking on particular things. And I often find as a player that once I've gone through that kind of tutorial, I'm still somewhat confused as to what I'm meant to be doing, because all I've done is I've followed these breadcrumbs and I haven't had to really think about what I was doing. So allowing the player to experiment, it can be good at the tutorial stage. Often tutorials close off everything else apart from that one interaction that they want the player to have. And while in some circumstances I understand you don't want the player to be doing things that are going to break the game or cause problems, there are other ways of closing off some functionality and still allowing other functionality, because players do learn better by experimentation. So try not to close off the functionality of the game whilst you're doing the tutorial stuff. And then give them something to actually achieve. I got this phrase here, see one, do one. There's a phrase used in medical education, which is see one, do one, teach one. You can't really use that in games, but getting to see one and then do one, get the brains working, ask them to do something, show them how to do that particular thing, and then ask them to do something slightly different, so they've got to adapt what they've done. And I have to say, I use this an awful lot in educational ways, particularly with programming. I'll show students how to do something particular, and then the challenge is, I want you to do something that's not exactly the same as this. So I want you to be thinking about adapting what you've just seen. And that adaptation really does bring home the learning and give them things. Okay, so that was the first barrier. The second barrier is the barrier to immersion. So I do talk about immersion in some of my videos to do with games design. And for some games, the goal of being as immersive as possible is quite an important goal. For other games, it's not so important. So it depends on your genre and it depends on your game as to how important this issue is. However, there are some things that you can do in general, but in particular to do with the tutorial, that can help you establish and maintain this immersion. So this is the feeling that the world that the player is in, or the player character in, is real. So using in-game characters to give instructions rather than a disembodied voice or disembodied text can help. If you can avoid as much as possible referring to the controls, it's not practical usually to entirely ignore the controls, but things that refer to the controls make the player think about the controller, and then they end up kind of thinking outside the game in that sense. And it depends on your control system, but there are a lot of control systems out there for games that are quite standard. And so if you tell the player to jump and they're on a in a PC game, then the most likely thing they're going to do is to try hitting the space bar. And using standard controls can help you with this. Sometimes you'll have rookie players who really don't know these conventions, and so you have to find a way of teaching them. But wherever possible, don't refer to the outside world. Um, and then if you can make the learning part of the game story, that's really good in terms of working towards immersion at your tutorial level. And there are a whole load of ways that I've seen this done, but often they're uh, done in such a way where you start the player character off as some kind of apprentice or trainee. They've got to go through some combat training before they're leashed out on the wider world, or uh, whatever. If it's a management game, they've got to go through the management trainee program or something, and you can make it part of the overall experience, and so it doesn't feel separate in that sense. And if you manage to do that, then that can help keep this immersion going. Um, and the third one in this section of barriers is the barrier to fun. So there's a bit of a dichotomy here, which is that learning is fun, and we kind of the psychology of games knows this, knows that actually one of the big things in games is learning, and learning, usually learning mastering techniques, learning how to play the game. Chess is a game which is entirely reliant on the concept of learning for its appeal and for its fun. And yet, somehow, education has missed a lot of why learning is fun and how learning is fun. And I guess, to the same extent, game designers who are really good at designing compelling game experiences that make the player really engaged, and part of that is learning, can still, when they're deliberately trying to teach the player how to play the game, so the mechanics of the game, uh, that can fall apart, and they forget that you need to make this fun as well, the learning of the game. And actually, it's a really important part of keeping the player through the end of the tutorial. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So uh, there are some things that you can do in particular towards helping the tutorial be fun. And so one of them is to make sure you use the core gameplay. So games are often designed with this idea of a core interaction or a core gameplay. What is the thing that the player is going to enjoy doing on a second to second basis whilst they're playing the game? And if that's compelling, then that's a great thing for the game, because it means that the game probably will be a compelling game. But it also means that fairly obviously you want to make sure the player gets into this gameplay as quickly as possible in the tutorial. So whatever your core gameplay elements are, then make sure the player encounters them early, and I guess importantly in the same way that they will do later in the game, so that it is this fun experience. Um, don't forget that part of the fun in games is to do with having risk and reward, and rewards and challenges. But this idea of reward and challenge is often missed when you get to tutorials. And tutorials are the kind of perception is that they need to be easy so that the player can learn the game. So you reduce the challenge, and that the reward is the learning of how to play the game. And I would disagree with that. In the rest of the game, you're going to use all sorts of different tactics for rewarding the player. Um, you should be thinking about using them in the tutorial as well. So give them something that will help them later on in the game. Um, Okay, so moving on. So the second part is actually somewhat related to what I've just been saying about giving the player things, which is player investment. And so it, it's reasonably obvious as you think about it that players will invest more and more emotionally and in terms of commitment to games as they go through games. Some players will start a game with a huge commitment already. I find myself when there's a new Grand Theft Auto game out, I know that I'm going to want to play all the way through the game. In fact, I've got a history of 100% completion for GTA games. And so if a new one comes out, I'll be thinking, I want to do 100% completion for this. Um, and so I'm already committed before I even start to play. But this isn't a common thing. And for many games, that commitment has to be bought from the player. You have to give them reasons to be committed. So there are all sorts of ways of doing this. And here's a screenshot from Stardew Valley. Uh, Stardew Valley has farming in it, and farming is such a good commitment mechanic because it gets the player to plant something, and then they have to come back later to reap it. And that mechanic of doing something now, which will give you something later, is a hugely powerful mechanic in terms of getting commitments out of the player. So a common place to stop for players is actually at the end of the tutorial. You probably had this experience yourself. You've got a game, you've downloaded it, you play through the tutorial, and at that point you think, well, that's enough for today, and so you've stopped. And so the question is, how do you uh, give the player things that they're going to want to come back for? Because this is such a natural break, or it can be, that often players will kind of wander off and do something else and get distracted by something shiny. So uh, it's good to give them some investment in the game. Again, like the farming mechanic or something. So a seed task is something like the farming where you've done something and you're going to reap a reward later. And as I've been saying, this really gives some kind of commitment to the game, starting along the process. So something that you'll extend later. The whole concept of XP and leveling can be part of this. And in fact, if you've got a situation where if you've got it timed and good designers take control over things like this, so that you've actually had your player level up once through your tutorial, and they're maybe, I would say, 2/3 to 3/4 of the way to level 2 by the time they get to the end of the tutorial. Then they can see that this next leveling is within sight. And that's more likely to bring them or to get them to continue playing or bring them back to playing. The other thing is potentially significance. So tutorials are often kind of couched in terms of being somewhat separate to the rest of the game. And I've talked about this a few times in these videos. I've also talked about the idea that the tutorial can be part of the main game. And if you can then actually give the player things that they have done during the tutorial, which have had an impact on the world, then that already gives that player some kind of investment towards the game and some kind of commitment to the story that you've got. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to talk a little bit now. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit now. I don't know what you're going to talk about. I'm going to talk a bit about the design process or a potential design process for tutorials. Now, this particularly is geared towards the idea of not having so much a separate tutorial at the beginning of the game, but think about how do you teach the player through the game the mechanics that you've got and the different things that are available to them. There might be all sorts of parts of the games that you're going to teach them. So we're going to go through this design process, um, or a potential process for thinking about this. So the first part is to make a list of the mechanics. What are the actual things that you're going to want to teach to the player? Often very early on, there's some kind of camera control. Later on, you might have more advanced tactics or things that rely on other others of the mechanics. And then fairly obvious, but put them in order. Think about the order in which the player needs to have these mechanics introduced to them, and what relies on what else. What do they need very, instantly to be able to do anything, and what comes later on in the thought process. Um, and then think about mapping them to the timeline of the game. So um, this is something that I will talk about in another video. The concept that your game has a timeline and you go from start to finish, and there may be changes as the game evolves as to what the player is doing. Um, but certainly, there may be changes to abilities, and players usually expect that if they're controlling a player character, that their capabilities will improve as they go through the game. And part of this is the mechanics and the abilities that they've got. So this part of the process is thinking about how you're going to spread these mechanics through your game. Are you going to spread them evenly all the way through? I think that's probably unrealistic. Are you going to have quite a few of them at the beginning and then drip some more in? And once again, this idea of the logarithmic graph comes to mind. You'll see other tutorials for that, videos of mine. But there is also a question of why would you teach something before the player needs it? So if you've got some mechanics that they're not going to need until later in the game, the fact that I had a screenshot from Avorion comes to mind there, which is a space game. It may be that in your particular space game that you're designing, that you've got a whole lot of flying around and shooting stuff that is early on, but later in the game you get to start to establish your own space station bases um, as you get more powerful and you get more money, and etc. So I guess the question would be, why would you show the player how to design those space stations until just at the point where they actually have that ability? One reason is that you could be tantalizing them and giving them something to look forward to, uh, which is a legitimate reason. However, if you teach them something at the beginning and then it's several hours later when they actually get to use it, they're unlikely to remember. And so teaching just before it's used is a much better tactic. And then for each mechanic, you need to think about some details. So you need to think about how you're going to introduce it to the player. So that's both in terms of the mechanic and how you're going to teach it, but also in terms of, does it have a story element? Do you have some kind of justification for why the player is being taught this particular thing at this particular point in time? And how are you going to make that happen? Then how will you get the player to try it? So you need to obviously give them some motivation. And I guess a lot of tutorials use the motivation of try this now. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but there may be better ways of doing it, better ways to motivate the player. And then there's the question of how you're going to reinforce it. So, as you probably know, people learn better if they repeat things. And again, spreading out that repetition is a good thing. So if you have a mechanic, say it's I don't know, a ranged combat mechanic using you've got a chain hook thing that can drag your enemies towards you, and you teach the player that, and then you use it in the next battle that they've got, and then you don't use it for another I don't know 10 missions or so, and then they come back to it. They might have forgotten about that, but if you kind of seed use of it then throughout the gameplay as they come across it in sporadically, then that reinforces this concept and it becomes one that becomes part of their palette of gameplay, as it were. Okay, so the final thing I think that I'm going to talk about is the problem of returning players. So I have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about this. I've got lots of bees, so I must have lots of bonnets when it comes to game design. I've been thinking about game design and some of the flaws and of course a lot of the good things that are done in game design over the 20 years that I've been teaching this stuff. And one thing that has come to mind several times is that uh, there is this pattern of play that some players have, and I've certainly had it for some games, which is that you play a game for a while, and then you leave it for a while, and then you want to come back and play it again. Um, and there's a problem here with tutorials, which is that you've learnt to play initially, and then you've forgotten when you come back after a while. So I guess the question is how many people. It depends on the game and what your how difficult it is to learn the game. But how many players will restart the game at that point? And I know that for some for some players and in some circumstances, actually that's a fairly legitimate thing to do. You want to restart, you want to have the full game experience. You think I'm going to be more dedicated to this game this time round. Um, Actually, I'm as an aside, I'm surprised how often, if I've started a game sort of two, three, four times, which can happen, that I seem to stop at very similar points. Which is an interesting thought about what is it about those points that mean that I'm drifting off. Uh, I've not been invested enough to pull me forwards through the rest of the game. Anyway, um, it might be good though to give the players the opportunity to pick up from where they left off. And so, in terms of tutorials, are there ways that you can do this? Are there things that you can do in terms of a quick refresher? And I've not seen this often in games. And I can't think off the top of my head many games that have done it. In terms of mechanics, a quick thing that you can do often is, as a player, again, I'm sure you've done this as a player yourself, is to have a look at the controls, the control options. Um, and that can help refresh you. There are some games which basically always tell you the controls as they go through. GTA 5 has a thing of doing this. It shows you the controls that you need to use at particular salient points through the game, and that's quite useful. It means you can get back in and you don't have to have remembered all the controls. Um, this is one thing. When there was the paper manuals back in history that you got with the game, which have almost completely died out now, of course. This did somewhat solve the problem in that you could have a quick flick through the paper manual and refresh yourself of the main points of the game. And I think that um, I would think it would be an ideal thing to have some kind of built-in, effectively little book that you can go to as a refresher within your game to say this is what you're doing, this is what you how you do it. Just in very quick. Ah, yes, of course, I get it now. I remember, says the player, and they can dive back in. Okay. So that's a bit of a look at some design thoughts. If I thought for another few hours, I'm sure I'll come up with a whole load more because I'm like that. But I think that's probably enough to be getting on with. So that's it from me for now.